Well, one of the forms that this counterattack seems to be taking, and now I'm looking again at the presidential race, especially on the side of the Democrats, and with Bernie Sanders at the forefront, calling for what he says is democratic socialism. But of course, many people point out that what he's really calling for is a form of social democracy. In other words, a reform of capitalism, not a complete overthrow of capitalism. And that raises the question, and this is something that too few people seem to be talking about, is something that at least back in the 1970s, I would say, people did question social democracy in the sense of saying, well, it has internal contradictions of its own that it has not resolved and cannot resolve. And you could even say that's the reason why it ultimately failed, at least in Europe, and went on a downhill decline, because it couldn't basically deal with the international context of basically a neoliberal financial system where capital is completely deterritorialized and can go wherever it wants, forcing basically the social democracies to adapt to this global condition, because otherwise they would be faced with a capital strike or a capital flight. And so I'm wondering now, on the one hand, there's no real debate, it seems, at least on the left, about, so to speak, reform versus revolution, I guess. That is the debate about, can capitalism be formed in the form of social democracy again, or do we need to understand why it declined eventually, from the 1970s onwards? Was there a logic that went beyond just ideology, and that there were, in other words, global financial forces at work in undermining social democracy? What's your response to that train of thought?
Well, you're right, of course, that the left that I was associated with at the beginning of the 1970s was very critical of the welfare state as it had been constructed in the social democracies in Europe, and to the degree that there was welfare even in the United States was critical of that, because many people saw the welfare state as an organized way to reproduce a class relation, not to challenge a class relation. And furthermore, it was also structured in such a way as to be anti-women. And so many feminists, I think, felt that the way the welfare state was orchestrated was perilous for them. So yeah, the left in the mid-1970s was highly critical of welfare state. But then, of course, the right took power and said, okay, we'll get rid of the welfare state, we'll wipe it all out. And then that led to a certain nostalgia on the left to say, what is it that we wanted to get rid of? But I don't think right now there is really an appetite for a restoration of that kind of welfare state. And I am very nervous about the democratic field right now, to the degree that it seems to me there is a tendency towards the restoration of a system that was about a reproduction of class relations, and will be so again unless we do something radically different. Now, again, fortunately, it seems to me that there are elements around, particularly feminist socialists and so on, who are going to say, no, we are not going to tolerate the restoration of that kind of welfare state. We want to guarantee people a decent life and a decent living space and decent protections of social security. We want all of those things, but not in a way that simply replicates the social order. Furthermore, we recognize right now that in many parts of the world, social welfare has been privatized through the NGOs. And the non-governmental organizations, of course, are working out there, dealing with a lot of the social problems, and the state basically says, I don't want anything to do with this, let the NGOs take care of all of the social issues. This is a big transformation, because as a recipient, if I'm getting something from the state, I make a claim upon the state and say, I'm a member, I'm a subject in this state, or I'm a citizen of this state, and I have rightful claims, and I want the state to deliver on those claims. When it all goes to the NGOs, in effect, you have to go and beg for charity. Now, this changes the position of a low-income person begging for charity or putting a legitimate demand upon the state which they believe has some responsibility for guaranteeing their welfare. So I think here too there is something which is saying there will not be a radical revolution in social relations without challenging that NGO structure, which is very difficult because there are a lot of progressive people in the NGOs. And you probably will remember that the initial World Social Forum, there were radical elements, but then also the NGOs. And the NGOs were in the end kind of doing a separate game from the popular movements. So I think that there are these issues which the left has not grappled with and which they need to grapple with if we are not to end up with a restoration of a kind of a soft version or a more sort of efficient version of the social democracy which was sort of hanging around us in the sort of early 1970s.
Before we conclude, I think one of the key things that you said is about avoiding the restoration of class relations through reform. And I'm wondering exactly what that might mean specifically. And that is, okay, in the case of NGOs versus making a demand on the state and claiming a right, I think that's relatively clear. But even that, claiming a right, by itself doesn't necessarily mean challenging or changing the class relations. And so I'm wondering, what would a change of class relations actually look like?
Well, just think for a minute how certain class relations were transformed in, say, major Latin American countries. One of the ways in which it was done was land reform. So the power of a landed aristocracy was essentially challenged by expropriation of the big estates and the division of them. And of course, that tradition is continued by occupations by the MST and all the rest of it. So you're in effect taking a power block, which was the landed elites, and you're breaking their power, and you're taking their assets and you're distributing those assets. And so this is a real attack upon the class relations. What I'm going to suggest now is something terribly outrageous, which is this needs to be done to the capitalist class. The concentrations of wealth in the capitalist class are now so enormous, so huge, that the capitalist class needs to be broken up. And actually, it's interesting. If you turn it to the corporations, there's now a genuine debate going on over, should we break up Google? Should we break up Facebook? Should we break up these huge monopolies and these huge concentrations of power? So what we're beginning to see is a kind of a political movement that says we've got to break up these powers. And at some point or other, that is going to carry over to breaking up that huge wealth which exists within the capitalist class. Now, the capitalist class is protecting itself and I think is well aware of this threat. If they're not, they must be daft, but they're well aware. So they are securing their control over the state apparatus to make absolutely sure that the state apparatus will do two things. One is that the state will never ever pass any legislation like land reform which kind of appropriates them, so they're going to sort of control the state that way. Second, any movements outside of the state that start to kind of actually do that are going to be repressed by police power in exactly the same way that sort of Occupy movement was repressed by police power, kind of rather brutally and unnecessarily, precisely because Wall Street knew that if you didn't squash these people early on, they might get traction, and if they got traction, their well-being and their position in society would be threatened.
Well, regarding the point about breaking up these big concentrations of power, I mean, one of the criticisms that people have made of that is that, well, you're just setting the clock back essentially maybe a decade or two, but eventually they're just going to reconsolidate. As a matter of fact, that's, of course, one of the points that Marx always makes, is that there's a concentration of capital and tendencies towards monopoly. And wouldn't the perhaps better strategy in that case be an actual, not necessarily state takeover, but certainly, for example, we could say perhaps, or argue perhaps, that a social media platform such as Facebook, or a search platform such as Google, or a distribution platform such as Amazon are actually forms of public utilities, and therefore should be turned over to the users, essentially. Not necessarily in the form of a state nationalization, but actually more in the form of something like Wikipedia, let's say. In other words, turned over to the people who are actually using it and benefiting from it. And as a matter of fact, that argument could be made because it's good that they're big, because that's where we get the benefit. Having one search platform, having one social media, having one distributor makes sense from a efficiency perspective at the very least. So you don't need to go to 10 different places and comparison shop, or need 10 different kinds of social media platforms. What do you think of that argument?
I think that's an interesting argument, and I think that to some degree what you see, for instance, in the Labour Party in Britain right now, McDonnell is proposing that there be a fund which will gradually give workers control over the corporations in which they work, because on the thesis that the productivity of the corporation resides with the workers, not with the capitalists. And this was, of course, the thrust of the Meidner Plan, sort of back in Sweden, in which each year by year, a certain amount of the worker remuneration was put into purchasing the stock of the corporation, and so that after about 20 years, the corporation would be totally controlled by the workers. So I think there are ways of starting to think about taking over or splitting up the power. Whichever way you go, you're going to disempower a capitalist class, and that has to be the ultimate objective, it seems to me, of the left politics, which is to disempower it one way or the other. And the way you're proposing is one way to try and do it. The other way is to break it up and kind of say, all right, we want to go back to the original format of the internet, where there was a lot of peer-to-peer, individual kind of, it was almost an anarchistic utopia for a little while. But then that ultimately gets consolidated, and you're right that there's no such thing as a move you can make, which there won't be a counter move, and therefore this idea that once you've got that, you're home free. No, there will be a constant kind of attempt to rebuild traditional centers of economic and political power.
Okay. Well, we're going to leave it there for now. Thanks so much, David, for having joined us.
Yeah.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.